Welcome to the 2021 Corporate Philanthropy Institute. Make it so. With gratitude to that quintessential enterprise captain, Jean-Luc Picard, I'm Dwayne S. Marsh, President and CEO of Northern California Grantmakers, part of the NCG crew that'll guide you on your journey over the next 2 days and across an incredible array of critical issues facing our sector. When I joined a little over a year ago, this was my first big event for our philanthropy community, and I'm happy to share my greetings to our corporate members and larger corporate community as we continue to address the challenges converging and pandemics assaulting our health, climate, the economy, democracy, and of course, the issues of racism. We want to thank our supporters and sponsors, Gilead, Google, Wells Fargo, Workday, eBay, Kaiser Permanente, Union Bank, and our media partner, San Francisco Business Times, for making today possible. I'll be back later today in the program for a remarkable conversation with national thought leader Hedda McGee that explores what our charge is as this sector in this defining moment in our history. But first, let me welcome fellow crew member Commander Steve Barton to share his welcome in our opening panel to help us boldly go where our communities need us to be.
Thanks, Dwayne. And I also like to offer my welcome to all of you. Those opening images we just saw paint such a vivid picture of what we've all experienced and seen over the last 18 months plus, and also lift up the critical role companies have played. And in the face of all those multiple pandemics we've had to endure over this time, you all are balancing all that's happening in the world with the mission of your company, the goals of your philanthropy, and what you're trying to achieve in the world. But the larger call of citizenship, shared responsibility, and community require us all to be bigger actors, take on bigger things, and make bigger plays. Over the next 2 days, we'll focus on the work ahead, what we're called to do, how we can take action, and in the immortal words of Captain Picard, make it so. Now, our opening plenary has a real small charge. They're going to set the context for the next 2 days. And to help us do that, I'd like to welcome to the stage our moderator, Yvette Radford, VP External and Community Affairs, Kaiser Permanente, Michael McAfee, President and CEO of PolicyLink, Martin Whitaker, CEO of Just Capital, Becky Ferguson, COO of the Salesforce Foundation, and Hector Mujica, Economic Opportunity Lead of Google.org. You will find their bios on the conference platform. Yvette, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Steve. Good morning, everyone. I am truly delighted to be here today to moderate the opening plenary session of the 2021 Corporate Philanthropy Institute. This morning's impressive panel will share how they've responded to the many challenges of the last 18 months and provide insights to help corporations and other organizations turn these challenges into opportunities that we can seize to enact meaningful and moral change. So as you know, we've collectively experienced a relentless pandemic that has laid bare longstanding racial inequities in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. We've seen ongoing threats to our democracy and a country divided by political affiliations. It's been almost 18 months since corporations joined millions of Americans demanding racial justice in support of Black lives after the murder of George Floyd. In response to these challenges, many organizations made statements and promises and significant financial investments. That was then, and this is now. Today, our communities, investors, partners, and consumers expect us to go deeper, to do more advanced systemic change and dismantle the systems that have plagued our country for generations. The time for real, equitable, and sustainable change is now. Our panelists will shed light on how corporations can and should use their power, their resources, and influence to help achieve this change. And it's an honor to be with them and with all of you today. So throughout the session, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat so I can include them into the discussion as much as possible. So let's jump right in. And I'm going to start, Michael, I'm going to throw the first question to you. So as you think about the future recovery and addressing the deep and complicated systemic issues that we face, what do you think should be the role and priorities of corporations?
Well, thank you for asking the question, and thanks for having me. It's good to be on the panel with colleagues who I deeply respect. I think I'll use some language that is usually from the nonprofit sector to describe the roles, but I think there are really three roles, and then there are some aspirations. CEOs should be standard bearers for what does it mean to step into racial equity, to create a just and fair society within their company, within community, and within the broader society. So that role of standard bearer is critically important at this time. As the trust in our institutions diminish, we often look to business for leadership. And I think there is a powerful opportunity now for business to step into that leadership role and be standard bearers for creating a just and fair society. The second would be a repairer. There's a great deal of harm that has been wrought on so many communities in this nation. And we see it every day in our communities. And I think corporations can use their voice to begin to repair that harm. They can use their leadership to pay living wages, sustaining wages for families. And so standard bearer, a repairer, have that reparative mindset about how do we address past harms and make them right today. And then lastly, to actually be a liberator. Our democracy and our economy are quite fragile. And they're quite fragile because of the toxicity that we've allowed to run through them for so many years. And it's finally catching up with us. 100 million plus economically insecure in this nation. That's 1 in 3 people who are economically insecure. That's not sustainable. So the last thing I will say is this. There were a host of pledges, billions of dollars of pledges made during the racial reckoning, if you will, of 2020. I think the most important thing one can do right now is to honor their word, honor those pledges, but honor them in a way that actually makes sure that people are actually better off, that 100 million is better off in this nation. So set the standard for what racial equity can be in this nation, what it can mean to create a just and fair society. Begin to do that work of operationalizing the standards by repairing past harms, and then looking upon the horizon and asking ourselves, what would it look like to reimagine designing a nation, our laws, our regulations, our customs, and our institutions so that they were just and fair for everyone? That's what I would ask people to consider.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Martin, I have a question for you. These are really dynamic and complex times. And can you talk a little bit about how stakeholder expectations have shifted over the last 2 years? And what changes companies should be making to respond to these expectations going forward?
Absolutely. Thanks, Yvette. And thanks to Dwayne, Steve, all our friends at CPI, all my esteemed colleagues on the panel. It's great to be here, especially to talk about this really important topic. You are 100% correct. Stakeholder expectations have fundamentally shifted over the last 18 months, 2 years. And by stakeholders, I mean expectations of employees, expectations of investors, expectations of society at large. And they've shifted to emphasize and elevate, let's call it the social dimension of business performance. The impact of corporations on our society is enormous. It's one of the reasons why Just's strategy as a nonprofit is to really focus on changing business behavior. There are tremendous incentives, and I think that's a key message for this audience. There are tremendous incentives for companies to lead on setting racial equity standards and being a leader on equity overall and being a leader on stakeholder performance. All the data shows that when you look at portfolios of companies that have outperformed on matters of human capital, they tend to do better in the markets. But there's also, I think, a very strong economic reason, which Michael hinted at, which is when you've got a third of the economy essentially feeling as though it's not working for them, 100 million people, you're operating at way under capacity. And so, we need all Americans now to feel like they have a stake. And our survey work, for the last 7 years, we've been surveying the American people on many, many issues relating to company performance. And the most recently, over the last 18 months, on human issues and societal issues, in particular around racial equity post George Floyd. And I can tell you that a substantial majority of Americans expect companies to do more. Almost 80% of all Americans believe that companies have a really important role to play in advancing a more equitable society. We see it always at the top of the list of all the issues that we track for companies. We have been tracking, as you know, through our racial equity tracker on the Just Capital website, how companies are responding to their commitments, what commitments they're making, what actions they're taking. And we partnered with PolicyLink and FSG and other companies now to create a set of standards that make it easier to show the way for what companies can do and what CEOs can and should be doing. So the path is there, but I come back to the incentives. When stakeholders expect companies to lead, they tend to get rewarded for that leadership, get rewarded by attracting and retaining more talent, by having way better relationships with their investors, by generating stronger returns, building better ties to their communities where they operate and their suppliers. So I could go on. There's a tremendous, long list of business benefits. And I feel as though that's really what's changed. We have recognized now that this is not an issue that is sort of tangential to business performance. It's at the core. You can't have a just economy or a just society unless you address some of fundamental issues of unjust behavior. And I think that's what business has it within its grasp to do right now. And we're anxious to show the way and to celebrate leadership wherever and whenever it occurs.
Great. Just a follow-up. Are there examples of leading edge and authentic responses that you've seen that you can that could provide a roadmap or a blueprint for the rest of us?
Well, as I say, if you go to justcapital.com, go onto the Corporate Racial Equity Tracker, there are many, many examples of leadership there. I would call out Target. We think they've done a great job of really responding in the workforce. We think Salesforce has done a great job too. We pointed to multiple examples there. Perhaps Becky will talk about that. And there are other examples of companies that have really stepped up. JP Morgan with their community funding. So we've seen, I would call out Hewlett Packard as well. I'm interviewing the CEO in a couple of weeks. They've really leaned into advancement of Black and brown executives throughout their business. So there's tremendous specific, examples all across the board within companies, within sort of business communities, and then within society at large, which are the three elements of our CEO blueprint.
Great. Thanks so much. Now I want to pose the next question to both Hector and Becky, because you both represent large global companies. So can you talk a little bit about how your company has responded to the changing expectations of the role of corporations addressing the issues of racial justice, equity, and systemic change? And why don't we start with you, Becky?
Thanks, Yvette, and hey to everyone out there joining us today. It's great to be here together. I think at Salesforce, similar to other companies, we actually step back and use this as an opportunity to actually look at how we approach this issue a little differently. So it wasn't just about, hey, let's make one sizable donation and the job is done. But last year, we set up a racial equality and justice task force at the company, which included representation from senior executives across the company, as well as employees from all levels, and really organized ourselves around and our response around 4 key pillars. So looking at how can we build and support a more just and equitable society from the angle of our people, our purchasing, our philanthropy, and policy. So really looking at it as a philanthropy plus model. And alongside that, really started from a place of listening. And then from there, moving towards really concrete goals and metrics, and then standing up new programs, partnerships, and processes to move towards those goals. And they weren't goals for 1 year. These are goals for 3, for 5 years. So a long-term commitment, for instance, around doubling our Black leadership inside the company, looking at how do we use the power of purchasing to really transfer more of our purchasing to Black-owned businesses. Also, we are looking to channel $100 million to Black-owned and underrepresented founder companies through our Salesforce Ventures team. And then alongside that, a commitment around philanthropy and our employee engagement, as well as work on the policy front at the federal, the state, and the local level. And so really looking at how do we come at this from multiple angles, start from a place of listening, but really set clear goals and metrics. And then also really turning the lens inside the company, as well as how do we contribute to the broader community. So I think those are really noticeable, powerful shifts. And I know we're not alone. A number of companies also really looked at this issue from a lot of different angles. And so we're excited to also learn with and alongside our other peers. So yeah, Hector, I'll popcorn it over to you as well to share about what this looks like at Google.
Thanks, Becky. First and foremost, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with so many esteemed colleagues and having this really important dialogue between us as people that have a tremendous privilege and responsibility to be good stewards of the resources of these companies. Similar to Becky, similar to Salesforce, I think we did a big, robust internal look to see what were the spaces in which we were coming up a little bit short and how can we be shifting those spaces. So we did a pretty comprehensive exploration into our hiring and representation priorities with a deep commitment from the company to, again, increase representation in senior leadership roles by at least 30% across all levels by 2025. We made aggressive commitments across various geographies that are much more diverse to increase our hiring in those locations, and by extension, increase our diverse hiring. We've done tremendous work around retention and progression, well-being for our employees of color, some work in our equity and our people process, and a lot of anti-racism education, which I think is also incredibly important. The other component that I'll mention before I get to the philanthropy piece is also incredibly important, which is ensuring that our products are reflective of our users. And that's been another big step and big accountability step that the company has taken, and ensuring that all of our users, including our Black users, our Latino users, see themselves reflected in our products. And are not just seeing themselves reflected in our products because they're using them, but they're seeing themselves reflected in our products because they're making those products. They're part of the teams that are contributing from a technical perspective into the build out and design. So those are just a few snippets of what we're doing at a corporate level, specifically in philanthropy. And that's where I sit at google.org. Racial justice is not a new topic for us. We've been operating in this space since well before 2020, making several catalytic investments in various organizations that have been at the forefront of rectifying injustice and elevating narratives of racial equity for many, many years. Since 2015, we've invested over $100 million in grants that aim to do just that, to advance racial equity and support the flourishing of underrepresented communities. And as I think about that grant making, and as I think about some of the lessons that we've learned over the past several years that we've been engaged in this work, the things that really stand out to me are a few. One is the importance of showing up in the moments that matter most. I think there have been pivotal moments in the last year and the last several years that have really impacted disenfranchised communities. And like my colleague Michael was mentioning earlier, we do have a responsibility. CEOs, companies have a responsibility to own the pulpit that they have, the megaphone that they have, and help rectify or shine a spotlight on those issues. So showing up what matters. And the other component is being bold in our risk taking as philanthropists. I think we have a philosophy at google.org that philanthropy is uniquely positioned to take risk, to take long-term bets on solutions that are going to take a while and a lot of money and a lot of effort to rectify. And that's been at the DNA, at the core of the moonshots that we tend to take as a philanthropy. That includes funding organizations that we're not certain if they're going to be successful or not, but we're taking a bet on a leader. We're taking a bet on people that are really embedded in the grassroots movements of various initiatives, and really just betting on that individual and journeying with them along the way. We also acknowledge that philanthropy is not enough. So we also tend to think about our philanthropy as catalytic investments. What are spaces in which our philanthropy can truly be unlocking additional resourcing and additional support, whether from within Google or other sources of funding, government and other private sector. An example of this is a small business initiative that we launched last year with Opportunity Finance Network. Google.org, through a $10 million grant investment to support minority-led small businesses, was also able to encourage and unlock an additional $125 million worth of investment from Google's balance sheet, from Google Treasury. And in doing so, reached thousands and thousands of small businesses with low interest loans, enabling them to stay open and keep serving their communities throughout the pandemic. So that to us is incredibly important, that idea of catalytic investments, that idea of encouraging other businesses and other entities from within Google or beyond to also be engaging and grappling with these topics. Because as we think about these various emerging challenges that our communities are facing today and our society is facing today, it's not something that philanthropy can solve on its own. And it's really important for us to expand that as corporations, for us to expand that into the whole of the business so that we can truly own and shift the needle.
Great, thanks, Hector. And you touched on this a little bit, and this question is for everyone. The pandemic really gave all of us permission to respond rapidly and differently, to experiment and to be incredibly responsive and take risk. So how do you think this will shape the future of philanthropy? So whoever, I open this up to everyone.
I'm happy to kick off of that. I think philanthropy, when it's truly effective, can show the art of the possible, what can be done. And I think, as Hector said, it can catalyze additional forms of capital. And we know that it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. In other words, until core business practices and procedures and behaviors and norms change, then philanthropy is fighting an uphill battle. And by now, I'll give you an example of that, which is the idea that living wage, which we've worked on. This notion that it's a norm, it's an accepted untruth that companies can't lift wages and pay their workers a living wage, because that's antithetical to good business performance and good investor performance. It's going to be detrimental to returns. And we just haven't seen that. The data doesn't bear that out. When you see companies, large retailers lift wages, inching towards local living wage levels, you actually see a sharp drop as the market reacts with that sort of knee-jerk response. But then those companies go on a tear. And I think that's a good example of how you've got to be able to get right into the heart of business and why business is so important. Business culture and these behavioral norms that we have can have such an impact. And I think philanthropy's got a crucial role to play. Whenever I've been involved with philanthropy, it really can show what's doable and show what's possible if, as Hector says, it's smart and it has courage.
I agree with what Martin said. This notion of the power and potential of philanthropy is significant, and it's needed now more than ever. The results that we want to see in the world, they're held hostage, and civil society can't deliver them, and we need to be honest about that. We can't deliver on them because the legal and regulatory frame of this nation doesn't work, and quite frankly, our government holds a hostile disposition towards people of color and poor people generally. And if there's anything that this moment is about, it is about, would we be so bold as to expect the nature and the logic of our governing institutions to change? Will we do that? Charity isn't going to get us out of this. It's really important, and it is catalytic, and it's shown us a lot of things, like in an inefficient market, getting money directly in the hands of people so that they can take care of themselves is probably one of the most innovative things we could do. And we should continue to do it. And I really signal that philanthropy should really continue to push that, because to me, that is right out of the corporate playbook of creating that user experience that so many of us benefit from when I'm thinking about my phone or my car, et cetera. Think about it today. 5 million folks facing imminent eviction, billions of dollars just sitting in local government, not getting in the hands of people simply because of bureaucratic red tape. So when we think about this, that's what I mean when I say that hostile disposition. It's slow to get out because we think everybody's trying to just get over and steal. And when we hold those types of perspectives, we create systems that don't work for folks who need them. And so I think now is a time for philanthropy to begin to think about the design of our nation so that it will work for everyone, and to begin to look at issues like this issue of why is it that local government can't seem to get money in the hands of those most in need in a crisis, but it can find business. Right. That's what we've got to get to right now. And I think using that voice, and the last thing I'll say is this, because we've seen many companies say now they're going to pivot from racial equity. We even see an administration who centered it, but still is quite timid, quite frankly, on the issue. Philanthropy must make sure that folks do not walk away from this moment. And that's why I use the language of results. You forfeit the right to talk about results if you will not deal with racial equity structurally. And if there's nothing else you take away, I hope that you really hear that all of this work is good, but it means nothing if we do not tend to the design of this nation, and we tend to it in those years when this work is not sexy.
So go ahead, Hector.
I was just going to mention that I just want to echo what Michael said. I mean, I think really, Michael, what you just mentioned really struck a chord with me. As I think about your question, Yvette, there's kind of two trends. And one of them I did want to highlight was aligned with what Michael was saying, but there's two trends that I think we're seeing as a result of a post-pandemic philanthropic world. I think one, there's an expectation from our stakeholders, going back to what Martin was saying, that we have to go beyond traditional CSR. Like, long gone are the days where you can do CSR in a silo and stick the do-good department to do good things in a corner. I think we've very much entered a new era where CSR, ESG, these ideas of social good and social responsibility have to be integrated into every aspect of business, and it has to be at the core of doing business. So I think that's one, a systemic shift that we're seeing. Two, and to Michael's point, is really around trust. I think there is something that I saw that really encouraged me around the pandemic, and an action that we took as a philanthropy at google.org was to release all of our grantees from their obligations on previously made grants and enabling them to have a cash infusion when they needed it the most. In the years where they were taking a dip on their fundraising, they were needing to respond to a moment in time that was demanding a lot out of them. And it was really encouraging to see other funders do the same. It was really encouraging to see other philanthropic actors like Mackenzie Scott and others really dive into releasing unrestricted dollars to large nonprofit organizations, dollars that are the lifeblood of these groups. And I'm really hopeful that we'll see that become a signal of greater trust in the organizations that we support, and we'll see more of that unrestricted investment. And by extension, I think that also spills over into trust in people. Another thing that we did during the pandemic was lean into direct cash transfers. We unlocked over $10 million to support organizations like Give Directly and a handful of others, Family Independence Initiative, to support individuals with unrestricted cash access. And that to us is a meaningful, powerful, disruptive tool where you can enable an individual to make decisions for themselves. You can provide them with dignity and autonomy. That has a much more profound impact than the $1,000 you might be giving that individual. It has a profound impact on the psyche of that person. And I'm also really hopeful that that's a space that we as corporate philanthropy will remain committed to, and a practice that we'll see evolve.
Yeah, I'll jump in and echo Hector as well. I feel like the last 18 months also, I think, caused us to really stop and pause, say, is this really necessary? Are the steps in what we do to direct our philanthropic capital really adding value? If not, let's strip them away so that our nonprofit partners are really, that we're there to enable and help support them to do the great work, be more strategic, be even more effective. And so I am optimistic that there will be continued shifts in funding practices towards more flexible funding, more general operating support, more multi-year funding, really the kind of resourcing and support that we know is what nonprofits need to do the best work. And how can we make the how of our work as simple, as streamlined, as easy, so that we are really enabling those resources to do as much good as possible. So I hope that those will be practices that stick around or that speed up, accelerate. Certainly they're not new topics, they're not new conversations, but I think the last 18 months really forced us to look at how can we operate more efficiently in the work that we do so we can enable more impact. I'm also optimistic too around some of the coalitions and work across companies. So for instance, just a specific example of an effort we've been a part of, there probably are some other members of the Reboot Coalition on the call today, but that's just one example of a number of companies coming together around a very specific goal of looking at how can we collectively pool our resources to really try to address the gender gap in tech and double the number of Black, Latina, and Native American women graduating with computing science degrees over the next 5 years. And rather than all going at this alone and making a number of philanthropic investments independently, really use that as an opportunity to put our collective resourcing together, learn together around this issue. And I think examples like that have a potential to be really meaningful. And certainly if anyone out there is interested in learning more about that coalition, please reach out to me. I think it's just one example of the power of coming together around specific goals and working in partnership. Because certainly as individual companies, yes, we have a lot of meaningful resources and assets, but certainly they're not sufficient to address these issues alone. So we need to do it together.
Great, thanks. And you touched on this a little bit, but if you all had to look in your crystal ball, do you think these changes are a blip, or do you think they're really being institutionalized?
Well, that I can tell you just from tracking this that it's across the board. You know, I think we see some companies on, I mean, every company's on a journey. Some, we talked about some already, but, you know, are really moving faster than others. I think the one thing they have all in common is is really, needing to know what that path looks like. I draw the audience's attention to some recent polling from Edelman on racism in business and the link between equity and business performance. And it was interesting to me looking through this, how many people saw their employer as the most trusted institution for to address equity issues and a response to George Floyd and racism response over government, over nonprofits. So I think private employers have a big role to play, and there's a lot of incentives there, as I mentioned earlier. Certainly, I think employees expect companies to step up and do more and want to be part of that journey. So I think it's for companies, and Michael knows this because we worked together on the CEO blueprint and now the alliance. It's really being shown the way. I think having a really honest assessment, an objective assessment of where you are right now. We've done a survey recently of disclosure at Just Capital of companies on human capital, a range of human capital issues. There's a lot of commitments, not a lot of action, and not a lot of disclosure. And we know that's coming. We know companies are going to have to say more and show people what they're doing. So I think being on that journey, understanding where am I now, where are my peers, how do I benchmark leadership, and how do I get from A to B? That's if you're in business today and you're not asking yourselves those questions, you're going to be behind the curve. And so I think every incentive is there, and there's a big reward, as I say, for those willing to lead.
Great.
I'm extremely hopeful. Think about it. It's only since 2020 have we really had all three sectors come to racial equity in such a big way. These are early days still. And yet, every sector has stepped into it in bold ways, and there's still a lot of work to do, but I remain extremely hopeful. But I'm also hopeful for another reason. People of color will not be denied. Our spirits are indomitable, and this is the direction of this nation, and that's why there's so much tension right now. Everyone gets a chance to participate in this democracy and to perfect it or destroy it. And the numbers on the side of wanting to perfect it are just as strong as those who want to make another nation, a nation that doesn't work for all. And so I think ultimately that I'm hopeful for is I'm seeing institutional leaders who are stopping this process of trying to put their finger up to the wind to see if it's okay to lean in this direction. And I really want you to take a note from what's happening in the world right now. Folks who will deny me the right to vote and make it illegal for me to give my mother a glass of water for standing in the line for 8 hours to vote, they don't ask how I feel about it. They're not worried about my feelings. They're not trying to frame it. They're not worried about the narrative. They're doing the thing that is fundamental in democracy. They are participating in it and shaping it as is their right. And we don't have to begrudge them. We should do the same. Why are we ashamed to say that we love each other, that we care for each other, and that it's okay for us to go out into this world and advance an agenda that is grounded in that? And I think you can be hopeful from what you see. But more important, you can be hopeful if your head and your heart is in the place that I'm describing. And I know that this is what this nation is becoming. So while there's going to be a lot of pain and disappointment, this victory is already won for us. Our job is to continue to step into our power and to realize it and to actually step back and actually see. The racial equity movement is strong and has delivered something that folks 22 years ago thought we would never see. 3 sectors talking about racial equity, a beautiful multiracial coalition going to the streets and advancing this issue. So this is a promising time. It's fraught with a lot of peril, but if we continue to do the right work, we will create that just society where everybody can reach their full potential.
Building on Michael's comments, Becky, Hector, Martin, what do you hope for in 2022? I'll start with.
I can go off with that one. I think the thing that gives me hope, I think continuing on the theme of things that we're hopeful for, things that are giving me life and encouragement right now, is human ingenuity and human tenacity. I think I've gotten to see that throughout my career, my exposure, and so far, whenever we've been faced as a society with really thorny problems, really difficult issues, our collective response has always been, for me, a bright spot. One of my previous career iterations, I used to lead our humanitarian work at google.org. And in that role, I got to spend time engaging with people that have gone through the unimaginable. I got to spend time in Nepal in 2015 after a very destructive earthquake, and different geographies that have been going through war and disruptions and forced migration, forced movement. And one thing that always stood out to me about all the individuals that I engaged with was, no matter how hard the hardship, they still had this ready to get after it attitude. They still had this we will persevere mood. And I think that speaks to the human spirit. That's not unique to these populations. That's what we saw right now with the pandemic. We put our intentionality and resolve to get something done, like understanding a complex virus and inoculating against it. And we got it done in record time. So I think for me, the bright spot, the thing that kind of gives me hope going into 2022, that gives me encouragement, is to keep grounding myself in the reality that it might seem dark out, it might seem gloom, but the human spirit, human ingenuity, and tenacity is going to overcome. And I'm very centered and very hopeful on that.
Yeah, Hector, I'm right there with you as well. The thing that I think brings me a lot of hope and energy are definitely the stories of individuals, of nonprofit leaders. I don't know about you all, but my LinkedIn feed yesterday, the Day of the Girl, was full of these like very beautiful stories and images of women. Some I thought I knew well, others I'm less close to, talking about their lives and their experiences. And I found it really hard to stop reading them. And the story, the depth, the dimensions of individuals and the human spirit, that brings me so much hope and energy. Right now, one thing we've been doing as a company this year too is carving out some of our philanthropic capital to really direct towards smaller, younger nonprofit organizations led by people of color and other underrepresented groups that historically had been a gap in our philanthropic capital in the sector as a whole. But it's just been incredible to learn about new organizations and to imagine being able to support them to reach their goals. So those individual stories of people, of organizations, definitely sparks hope and energy in me. And when you see them as a collective, that helps me to sort of think about, yes, there's if nothing else, the last year has reinforced that change is the only constant, and there is a ton of uncertainty out there, but inside of all of that is incredible resilience and opportunity. And so just looking at how personally to kind of take that, the worry, like right now, I'm very worried that our new 1-year-old dog Ralph is in the living room destroying something, but like, okay, that's a worry, but trying to like set that aside and worry about the things that matter and channel that energy into action to help shift and shape things in a positive direction, and knowing that we're not out there alone, that there are others doing incredible work. And so that sort of lights up the sky for me and brings me hope.
So for others, what worries do you have? What keeps you up at night?
Well, I didn't do my hope
Oh.
yet.
Okay. Well, let's hear your hope, and then you can start off with your worries too.
I don't want to talk about my worries. Talk about my hope. No, what gives me hope, honestly, is the passion and the brilliance of the people that I work with, not just at Just Capital, but all our partners. I mean, I think as a team, an extended team that cares about the mission, we kind of keep each other going. So I draw a lot of inspiration from those around me directly, and I've just been amazed. People have been through a lot in the last 18 months, and as someone said, if you want to be a diamond, you got to get used to being cut. And I think we taking a lot of hits, and the folks I work with and the folks that are all part of this movement and what we're trying to do at Just, we keep getting back up and making those changes and just driving it forward. Just keep going. Just keep going. And that's part of what you have to do if you want to achieve anything in life. Sometimes you just got to keep going. And so that's what keeps me going. It's also, you talked about what worries me, I think, or my fears, I would say. I wonder what has happened to truth. I sort of feel like I was at an event last week in Menlo Park, and we were talking about, and it was a group of nonprofits, and we were talking about what happens in a world where up is down, black is white, yes is no, and wrong is right. Like how do you argue? How do you even know what you're disagreeing about if you can't agree on the same set of facts and truths? That's what worries me a lot. I don't know where that goes, and I don't know how that plays out.
Great. Anyone else in terms of worries and what keeps you up at night?
What worries me is the number of leaders of color that are kind of stepping away from the work because they're tired. And I worry, will they come back? And I worry that they don't often have many institutions out there that they can go to and do this work where every day is not a fight about, can I do racial equity work? I mean, think about it, at a time when the most educated group is women of color, Black women. There are not many homes where folks can go, and every day when they walk over that imaginary threshold of work, they can go and be their full selves to do this work. And so the last thing I worry about is, are we building up the right type of institutions that can carry this work forward for generations to come? And if we don't build institutional heft, we're not going to be able to achieve the results that we want. So those are the things that I worry about.
So I know we're getting close to time. I'm going to ask you one last question. What's your wish for your peers and the companies that are gathered here today, and any tangible advice that you have for them? Why don't we start with you, Becky?
I would just say that I'm incredibly grateful for this community of folks working in corporate philanthropy. I know that often the sort of dial a friend, and there's always someone on the receiving end. So I think my wish is that continue to lean on one another and reach out and make time if you're on the receiving end of those emails or phone calls. And if you're struggling with something and scratching your head, no, you're probably not alone. And ask your fellow peers, your colleagues. So that would be my wish. Continue to connect and build community together.
Great. Hector.
My wish for my peers is that we'll remain unapologetically committed to equity and justice and continue to leverage philanthropy for that end. I've seen recently some news calling today's philanthropy woke philanthropy, or naming this whole movement as a political fad. And my wish is that we'll acknowledge that this is more than a fad. It needs to be more than a fad. It needs to be a norm, and a new normal for how philanthropy, which frankly has benefited from the wealth generation of historic injustice, begins to work to reparate the breach of its origin story, right? So I'm hopeful that my peers today will be moved by that conviction and be bold and swift in how they respond and continue to meet the moment.
Great. Martin.
Well, my advice would be to really look to the work you're doing as leverage. There is no issue that corporate philanthropy is working on. Is not a core business issue, and the resources of the private sector are many, many orders of magnitude greater than the entire philanthropic sector. So how can you be catalytic and shift the levers of the market overall so that we're pursuing the same goal? It's not something that happens down at the end of a corridor when we're feeling good and times are good and we want to be nice guys. No, I think these are core issues. They're core business, core economic, core social issues. And that's what's changed. And there's no going back. There's no going back. So I would advise everyone here to think, how do we be more catalytic, and how can we use philanthropy as a lever for major economic and societal change?
All right. And Michael.
I think we need to operate at the leading edge of this work. And, Dr. King has a quote that helps me get centered sometimes. And he said, "I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching for the oughtness that forever confronts him. And that oughtness is where we ought to operate. What ought to be in this world is where we should be pushing ourselves to get to, not what is. What is socially constructed, and what ought to be can be socially constructed as well. And that's where we should be operating, because that's the leading edge of the equity movement."
Well, thank you so much, to the panel, and thank you everyone for joining us for this opening plenary.